The Honourable the Treasurer. Order.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll run through the litany of farrago and fiction which the Shadow Treasurer.
Order.
Well, you were heard in silence. You were heard in silence. So do the same.
The member for O'Connor will cease interjecting.
He started off by saying, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the size of the surplus, 9.1 billion, came from fiddle numbers. That was the first claim. Again, another cheap shot at the government and the bureaucracy. Let me read on page 5.4 of the budget statements, section 5.4. The 1989-90 surplus of 9,122 million, or 2.5% of GDP, principally reflects the cumulative effects of decisions to restrain the rate of growth and outlays. Full stop. Not tax, restrain the rate of growth and outlays. They make that quite clear. Then on page 442, the Treasury has this to say. Taxpayers as a whole will be paying less tax in 1989-90 than would they have been the case if the tax rate scale in place in 1983-4 had been fully indexed for inflation. What do you say about that? Oh, I see.
Order.
The Treasury's written. I've written this. Is that right? The Treasury's written. That's right. So that's another cheap shot at the Treasury. That's right. That's it. Coward's castle. Back to attacking bureaucrats who can't defend themselves. Madam, Mr Deputy Speaker, so that's the point about the question about the scales. We've got just the sheer outcome of the revenue estimates for the year. The revenue estimates for the year make it quite clear. Here we are, net PAYE, gross PAYE 5.4%, less than the inflation rate. Less than inflation rate. Net PAYE 4.6, about 2% less than the inflation rate. Total individuals 8, slightly above the inflation rate, but this is supposed to be a big grab for money when in the budget is a 5.5 billion tax cut. I mean, he can't even understand there's a 5.5 billion tax cut from 1 July this year in this year's budget. It's the largest tax cut in our history. Is it any wonder? Is it any wonder net PAYE is running at 4.6? And then he says, oh, others are 20. Others are, of course, property and business income of individuals, unincorporated individuals, off last year's very high level of activity. That's what that is. That's what that is. And overall, it's 8. Overall, total income tax 10, off an inflation rate of 6.25, and the CPI running at about 7. So much for this business about fiddle numbers. And then he goes on to talk about RBA profits are being moved from one year to the next year. Wrong. Wrong. In last year's budget, in this year's budget, we had $440 million in the statement from RBA profit. Last year, it was 500. It's actually lower this year. RBA profits in the budget's lower this year than last year. Wrong again. Wrong again. Defence Service Homes, he tries to disparage that decision. It was made a couple of years ago, and the payment arrangements were made a couple of years ago. It's just where the thing falls. Don't hold up pathetic bits of paper to me, you pathetic character. Mr Deputy Speaker.
The member for Farrer will cease interjecting.
That was about the first 10 minutes with. That is, a fraudulent claim on RBA profits, a fraudulent claim about tax and about the surplus being derived from tax when it's been, as the Treasury says, from cuts in government spending. And of course that's true. The revenue share in GDP this year is 26.2, the same as 1982-3 and 1981-2. So what else do you need? I mean, what else do you need to defeat those points? And then he talks about a recession. I went through that in question time. 2.75%, he says. Over the course of the year, he said it'll be slower. But if it's average 2.75%, it will be slower. But not a recession. Not a recession. Because we've got net exports shifting and exports growing by 7% on average. And if he wants to talk about averages for growth, he's got to talk about averages for exports. So if exports are averaging 7 through the year, they're higher than 7. And that's what's going to keep production going and not have a recession, a crash landing like the one he gave us all back in 1982-3 and 3-4. And then we get this pathetic, hollow claim about the rape of the corporate sector. This is the crowd who had corporate profits, the gross operating surplus, at its lowest level in the post-war years. Its lowest level in the post-war years. And here they are. Here it was in 82-3, they were at 26%, the share of private non-farm corporate sector, at table 5 on page 226. and it's risen to 36.7, higher than the average of the mid-60s to early 70s at 31.1. So he talks about the rape of the corporate sector enjoying profitability unprecedented. Well, you say you're an economics professor. I've said this to you before. Where'd you get your ticket? I mean, if you can't understand a couple of basic facts like that, I mean, it must have come from a lucky dip. I mean, if you don't understand that the corporate share is now higher than it's ever been, and you're talking about the rape of the corporate sector, why do you think they're out there supporting us in their thousands in corporate Australia? Because they know what we've done for them. In this budget, we're giving $5.5 billion tax cuts, which comes off their wage bill. Had that tax cut not been there, it would have come out in a 12 to 15% nominal wage increase. That $5 billion is a $5 billion virtually the private sector has been saved, plus tax cuts cutting the company rate from 49 to 39, which is worth $2 billion, plus $8 billion a year now for dividend imputation. So in the last year they've picked up another $8 billion from us, and we're going to take from them $330 million a year from that, $330 million out of $8 billion, and you call that rape of the corporate sector. Well, 330. Yes, we've got to bring forward of 1.1, which is yes, but that's our money. The cost is 330. The cost of theirs is tax money. Tax money, mate. Tax money. Order. That's tax money. And the 330 million, the ongoing cost is 330 million a year. That's how much it will cost the corporate sector in real terms. 330 million a year against an $8 billion package in the last year. And the highest profits coming off a decline in unit labour costs, the largest we've seen in the OECD. And you talk about the rape of the corporate sector. Well, if you want to be incredible, foolish, well, you're doing a pretty good job of it. Now, wages policy. This is where I really started to get giggling. Wages policy. He said, what would they do with their wages policy? He said, if there's a breakout in the wage system. What would they do? The question is, what would they do? We've been in office 6.5 years. We've kept wages. We've changed the factor shares to get investment and employment going. The question is, what would you do? What would you do with the pilots wanting 29%? Say, oh, yes, that's... I mean, I know what your mate Reith next to you do. Say, go for your life. That's deregulation. Deregulation, 29%. Wreck the airline companies, move into all the metals awards in the airline industry, the transport industry. We'd have a 20% national wage increase going. You say, yes, but you see, that's the deregulated nirvana, Liberal style, just like in Margaret Thatcher's Britain. You all hold it up as a model. They got wages this year, the same craft structure as Australia, in your deregulated nirvana, growing at 10, with inflation going at 10. With inflation going at 10. In other words, with that structure, fellas, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And out there in the corporate sector, they know it wouldn't work, and they know productivity. Here he is, the pal over here, talking about productivity. Productivity. That is, he'll tie wages to 1% growth in productivity when the market wants to pay them 15, and yet disparage our outcome of 7. Disparage the outcome of 7, wants to pay them 1, but the market will pay 15. I mean, when are you people are going to understand that being a member of the Liberal Party is not going to be enough to get you office, pal? You're going to have to think of some policies, and that out there, the corporate sector knows that we've rebuilt them and profits and changing the economy, and they're not going to have you with that kind of sham policy. They know all the riff-raff on the Conservative side of business is in the Liberal Party, and they're not having you manage their affairs. They're not having you manage their affairs. You're the least prepared opposition ever for government, And Mr Peacock is the least prepared person holding the leadership of the opposition ever to contest the Prime Ministership of this country. And then he talks about failure to lift production and exports. I said in question time, exports have been running at an average rate of 7% for the last 5 years, the fastest rate in the last 25 years. The fastest rate in the last 25 years. Production. We've had twice the rate of GDP growth in the last 5 years on average that you had. Go and have a look at the charts. Have a look at it again in terms of the components of GDP. The chart, page 239. Here it is. GDP, 5 years to 88.9, 4% under Labor. 5 years to 88.3, 2.3. 5 years to 78, 2.5. Well, production you talk about, production. Then you talk about, then he says no micro reform. He says the tax system. Fancy having the hide. He advised Howard for 5 years. Fancy having the right to talk about the tax system when he had a 60% top marginal rate, a bottom rate of 30, double tax on dividends, 78 cents on the dollar tax on company distributions, and we've cut that to 39 with companies with a 47% imputation system by 1 January. We've got a top rate of 47 by January, not 60, and a bottom rate of 24, not 30. And he's talking about tax reform and the tax system. The kind of tax system they had, the only expanding industry they ever had was tax avoidance. The tax avoidance industry was their one great creation in the years that they were in office. And he's got the temerity. You see, there's one thing about the Liberals, I don't know, when you get a Liberal Party ticket, somehow you lose your shame. When you sign on, there's a sort of psychological drain and you lose your shame. That's the only way these characters could ever get up and talk about wages systems, tax systems, micro-reform, exports. I mean, the gall of you is faint-making. It's faint-making. And then here we're talking about the stability of the currency. And there's the old regulator out. The stability of the currency, you see. He's onto the Reserve Bank governor. He was used to telling what they should do with interest rates and the currency. Stability of the currency. He'd give us stability. He'd be in there tricking up the foreign exchange market until they clobbered him to death. But he thinks that all those 24 and 5-year-olds sitting on the Reuters screen in New York and Tokyo are going to say, oh, well, look, it's the people in the pinstripe suits back, so we'll leave them alone. We'll treat them kindly. They'd wash you away. They'd wash you away so brutally you wouldn't know which way you went. And of course, by the way, what did the governor say about you? What did the governor say about you? Throughout more than 6 years in office, this government's been very correct in its dealings with the bank. There's been no interference in matters of our responsibility. Only an insider can know that was not always been so. Only an insider can know it's always been so. He said he regarded the claims made against the bank as a slur against it, a slur. And that he's talking about is you. And you. He damned you in the most vicious way, in a polite but vicious way, for the way he knows all about you and the stability of the currency. But we've never heard from you about inflation adjustment. Your 4 press releases a day have gone to nothing after your mate here, good old empty head, got his inflation adjustment proposition going. Got his inflation proposition going. And what will be the result of that? He picks it up on a Sunday afternoon. Could you imagine something which will deny nominal interest deductions to the structure of this country, that would only allow real interest deductions? So today, instead of getting a deduction for 20%, you'd get 13. Could you imagine the gross irresponsibility of picking that up on a Sunday afternoon? A proposal like that, which would simply destroy corporate Australia, stop borrowings, which would lead to a failure to be able to fund the current account, which will lead to historic distortions and trafficking in existing loans, which would amount to enormous shifts of wealth, and watch Australian companies shift offshore where they could borrow and get full interest deductions. Could you imagine anyone being so grossly irresponsible as the Leader of the Opposition? And what have we heard from the Shadow Treasurer? Nothing. Nothing. He's hidden from every radio interview, every question for about 15 days, and well he might. When we're done with you on this question, brother, you'll be sorry you ever heard the term inflation adjustment. Because last night we put a real savings proposal together, as we've been doing for 6 years. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a sham proposition proposed by an incompetent person, and I have no trouble whatsoever in dismissing it and rejecting it with scorn and contempt.